It had been over a decade since I last saw my mother. The memories of her walking out when I was just a teenager were distant, but they had a way of creeping back when I least expected them. Life had moved on. I had a family now, a wife and 2 kids aged 8 and 10. My kids had never met their grandmother. In fact, I'd barely even spoken about her. It wasn't a topic I enjoyed discussing. So when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize, I wasn't prepared for what was waiting. "Mark, it's your mother. I need help." That was all it said. I stared at the screen, unsure if this was some kind of joke. But as I scrolled down, I saw more details. She claimed to be homeless, out of options, and with no family to turn to. The memories of abandonment tugged at me, but there was something else. My kids didn't know their grandmother. Was it right to deny them that chance? Against my better judgment, I decided to respond. After a few back and forth messages, she explained that she had nowhere to go and needed a place to stay, at least for a while. My gut told me to say no, but I couldn't shake the thought that my kids might one day resent me for not giving her a chance. So despite the hesitation, I told her she could come. When she arrived at the house, it was almost surreal. She looked older, of course, a little more worn down by life, but she was still recognizable. My wife, Jane, gave me a nervous look as my mother stepped inside, but the kids, completely unaware of the baggage she carried, were thrilled to meet their grandmother. Within minutes, she was sitting on the couch, laughing with them, telling them stories of when I was their age. Her charm worked quickly, and the kids warmed up to her faster than I'd expected. At first, things seemed fine. She played the role of the doting grandmother, showering the kids with attention. They loved having her around. She cooked meals for us and even helped clean up. It felt like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be as bad as I had feared. I stayed distant though, keeping a watchful eye but trying not to overthink everything. It was awkward having her here, but the kids didn't need to see that. It wasn't long before I started noticing small things, subtle comments here and there that didn't sit right with me. One evening when I told the kids to turn off the TV and get ready for bed, my mother chimed in with, "Oh, come on, Mark. Let them stay up a little longer. You were always too strict." I brushed it off at the time, thinking it was just a casual remark, but it stuck with me. Then, it happened again. I had disciplined my 10-year-old son, Tom, for talking back to his mother. My mother, sitting across the room, immediately came to his defense. "Your dad was always a little too hard on himself. I never treated him this way," she said. Tom looked at her, then at me, as if trying to figure out which version of the story was true. I didn't argue with her, but a sinking feeling settled in my gut. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The kids were starting to echo things my mother said. When I told them they couldn't have dessert after dinner, my 8-year-old daughter, Emma, shot back with, "Grandma says you never let her have any fun either." It was small, but it was enough to make me pause. I glanced at my mother, who smiled innocently, as if she hadn't just undermined my authority in front of my kids. Jane noticed it too. "Are you okay with this?" she asked one night after the kids had gone to bed. "I mean, she's already getting a little too comfortable." I nodded but didn't respond. It was clear we were both uneasy. Then, one afternoon, I overheard my mother talking to the kids while I was in the other room. She was telling them stories about my childhood, but the way she painted herself was different than the mother I remembered. "I tried so hard to make things work," she said, her voice filled with self-pity. "Your dad doesn't remember, but I was always there for him. He just never appreciated it." I felt a chill. The woman who had walked out on me when I was just a kid was now playing the victim in front of my own children. I knew I should step in and say something, but I hesitated. Confronting her would only make things worse, wouldn't it? Instead, I told myself it was harmless. The kids wouldn't really believe her, right? After all, they knew me better than that. But as the days passed, I noticed more changes. The kids were starting to push back against my rules more often. Emma refused to clean her room one morning, crossing her arms and saying, "Grandma says you were never good at listening." Tom, who had always been respectful, started talking back, echoing things my mother had said about me being too strict or not fun enough. I tried to talk to them, but it was like they were seeing me through a different lens, one that my mother had quietly provided. Small arguments between my mother and me became more frequent. I'd ask her to stop giving the kids treats after I'd already said no, but she'd brush it off with a casual, "Oh, it's just a little snack, Mark. Don't be so uptight." The kids loved it, of course, and I could see them starting to favor her more and more. I was beginning to feel the strain. Having her in the house was becoming more difficult with each passing day, but I hadn't yet reached the point where I was ready to confront her. Every time I thought about saying something, I hesitated, worried about how the kids would react. They were so taken by her charm, and I didn't want to be the bad guy. The tension was growing though. I could feel it. I just didn't know when it would finally boil over. Update 2. It didn't take long for things to go from uncomfortable to unbearable. The small comments my mother had been making turned into something more deliberate. I started noticing that when I wasn't around, she would let the kids do things I had specifically said no to. If I told them they couldn't have dessert because they didn't finish their dinner, she'd sneak them cookies later, saying, "It's just a little treat, don't tell your dad." The kids loved it, of course. They thought having grandma around was the best thing ever. She was fun, always bending the rules and letting them get away with things that I never would have. It was subtle at first, but soon they were openly comparing me to her. "Grandma lets us stay up late," or "Grandma says you're too strict." It was like she was planting the idea that I was the bad guy and she was the cool, understanding one. One evening, I caught her letting them watch a movie long after they were supposed to be in bed. I stood in the doorway, watching as she smiled and laughed with them, completely ignoring the bedtime rule I had set. When I finally spoke up, reminding them it was time to sleep, the kids groaned and whined. "Grandma says it's okay, Dad. Why can't we just stay up a little longer?" I looked at her, expecting some kind of apology or acknowledgement, but she just shrugged. "Oh, come on, Mark. It's just a movie. You're too uptight." It was the same line she'd been using, but this time I couldn't brush it off. The next day, things took a more serious turn. I was at work when I got a call from the kids' school. The teacher on the other end of the line sounded concerned. "Mr. Roberts, I'm not sure how to bring this up, but your children have been saying some things that are worrying us." My stomach tightened. "What kind of things?" "They've mentioned that their grandmother told them you aren't really capable of raising them alone, that maybe you're too strict or don't understand how to be a good father." There was a pause before the teacher added, "We just want to make sure everything's okay at home." I was floored. I thanked the teacher for calling, but I couldn't focus on the rest of the conversation. The idea that my own mother had gone behind my back, telling my kids in their school that I wasn't fit to be their father was more than I could handle. As soon as I got home, I confronted her. She was sitting on the couch, watching TV, as if everything was fine. "Why are you telling the kids that I can't raise them? And why are they saying these things at school?" She looked up at me, acting surprised. "What are you talking about? The school called me today. They're concerned because the kids are repeating things you've been telling them, that I'm not fit to raise them, that I'm too strict." She gave a dramatic sigh, as if I was the one overreacting. "Mark, I never said you couldn't raise them. I just told them stories about how you were as a kid. They're just children. They might have misunderstood." I didn't buy it. "Misunderstood? You're undermining me in my own house. You let them break rules, give them treats after I say no, and now this?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she leaned back in the chair. "I'm just trying to be a good grandmother. They need someone who's not so controlling all the time. You're making everything into a bigger deal than it is." I was furious, but I didn't want to argue in front of the kids, who were in the next room. "This has to stop," I said firmly. "You're not helping. You're making things worse." She didn't answer. Instead, she looked away, pretending to be hurt, as if I was the unreasonable one. The situation only got worse from there. The kids, who had once been respectful and listened when I gave them rules, were now questioning everything. When I told them to do their homework, they'd whine and ask why they couldn't just play like Grandma said. When I disciplined them for acting out, they would shoot back with, "Grandma says you were never good at listening either." It was like they were echoing everything she said, testing my authority at every turn. Even Jane, who had been supportive of me up until now, was starting to feel the strain. She didn't say it outright, but I could tell she was worried. "They're starting to act out more," she mentioned one night after the kids had gone to bed. "It's not like them. They've always been so good about following the rules." I knew exactly why. My mother had planted these ideas in their heads, and now they were questioning everything. It was a growing divide, and I felt like I was losing control of my own house. One evening, I overheard Tom and Emma talking in the living room while I was in the kitchen. "Dad's just always mad," Tom said quietly. "Yeah, but Grandma says it's because he never had fun when he was little," Emma replied. "She said he was always too serious." I stood there, frozen, listening as my own kids discussed me like I was the problem. They didn't see my mother's manipulation. To them, she was the fun, carefree grandmother who let them get away with everything, while I was the strict, boring dad who didn't understand them. The tension in the house kept building. Small arguments between my mother and me became more frequent. I'd ask her to stop undermining my decisions, and she'd just brush me off, claiming she was just trying to help. The kids were starting to side with her more and more, and I could feel the divide growing. But the final straw came when I found out she had been talking to the kids' teachers directly. She had gone to a school event behind my back and started chatting with their teachers, spinning her version of the story. By the time I found out, the damage had already been done. The teachers were concerned, the kids were confused, and I felt completely undermined. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. Every time I tried to confront her, she'd play the victim, acting like she was just trying to be a good grandmother. And the kids, they adored her. They didn't see what she was doing, but I did. And if I didn't act soon, I was afraid I'd lose control completely. Update 3. The manipulation didn't stop. In fact, it only got worse. My mother's comments became bolder, and the effect on the kids was obvious. She'd sit with them at dinner, talking about how I was such a difficult child and how I always blamed her for everything. She'd throw in little remarks like, "Your dad's just always been hard to please," as if she were giving them a glimpse into some hidden truth about me. The worst part was the kids were listening. Emma started asking, "Dad, why were you always so mean to Grandma?" Tom followed suit, repeating things like, "Grandma says you never appreciated how hard she worked." I could see it in their eyes. The seeds of doubt she had planted were starting to take root. Meanwhile, I was completely unaware of how far she was going behind my back. One day, I found out she had started attending the kids' school events without telling me. I only found out because another parent mentioned seeing her at a school play. I hadn't been able to attend because of work, but there she was, smiling and chatting with the teachers, as if she were the most involved and caring family member. She had even spoken to their teachers directly, sharing her side of the story. She just wants to be involved, one of the teachers told me when I went to pick up the kids the next day. She told us how much she's been trying to reconnect with you and how it's been difficult for her. It's great that she cares so much. I stood there, speechless. I hadn't realized how deep her manipulation had gone. She was playing the victim, painting me as the distant, ungrateful son who didn't appreciate her attempts to rebuild a relationship. She had even managed to sway the teachers to her side, making me look like the unreasonable one. It didn't stop there. My mother started showing up at the kids' sports practices and games. She'd bring snacks for the team, smiling and chatting with the other parents and coaches. I didn't know this until one of the coaches mentioned how nice it was to see their grandmother so involved. "She's really trying, huh?" he said, patting me on the back like I should be grateful. All of this was happening behind my back. I felt like I was losing control of my own family, not just with the kids but with everyone else too. The teachers, the coaches, the other parents, they were all buying into her narrative. And it wasn't long before my extended family got involved too. At family gatherings, my mother kept up the act. She'd tell stories about how she was trying so hard to help, but that I was so hard to deal with. At first, it was subtle, little comments here and there, but then she started bringing it up more openly. "Mark's always been stubborn," she'd say with a sad smile. "I'm just trying to make up for lost time with the kids, but it's hard when he doesn't appreciate it." My aunts and uncles, cousins, even my grandparents started chiming in with unsolicited advice. "Maybe you should try being a little softer with the kids," they'd suggest. "Your mom's been through a lot, Mark. Maybe you should give her a chance." It was infuriating. They had no idea what was really going on, and yet they were all quick to side with her, simply because she was older and more experienced. Then, Jane got pulled into it. It started with little things. My mother would make comments to her when I wasn't around. "Don't you think Mark is too hard on the kids? I remember when he was their age, and he was always so serious. Maybe you should try a softer approach. The kids might respond better." Jane, to her credit, didn't say much at first, but I could tell she was starting to question some of the things I was doing. If I put my foot down about a rule, she'd hesitate. If I said no to the kids, she'd look at me like she was wondering if I was being too harsh. The cracks in our relationship were starting to show, and I knew exactly who was causing it. Then came the family event that blew everything up. We were at a barbecue at my cousin's house. The kids were running around, playing in the yard, and I was trying to relax and enjoy the day. But my mother kept hovering. Every time the kids came to ask me something, she'd jump in before I could respond. "Oh, let them have one more dessert, Mark. It's not a big deal." Or, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." It was getting under my skin. I tried to stay calm, but after a while I couldn't take it anymore. When she gave the kids permission to skip cleaning up after themselves, I finally snapped. "Mom, stop undermining me in front of the kids. You're making things worse." She looked at me, feigning surprise. "Mark, I'm just trying to help. You're overreacting." I wasn't going to let it go this time. "No, you're not helping. You're causing problems. You've been going behind my back to the teachers, the coaches, and now you're turning the kids against me." That's when she flipped the script. In front of everyone at the barbecue, she turned the whole thing around on me. "I'm just trying to be a good grandmother. You're always so ungrateful, Mark. I've done nothing but try to reconnect with this family, and all you do is push me away." The family members who had been listening started murmuring, clearly uncomfortable. Some of them were already giving me looks, like I was the one in the wrong. "She's just trying to help," one of my aunts said quietly. Jane stepped closer, looking conflicted. "Mark, maybe we should talk about this later," she whispered, trying to diffuse the situation, but I couldn't stop. "No, we're talking about it now. You've been manipulating everyone, and I'm not going to let you keep doing it." The kids who had heard the commotion came over. "Dad, why are you yelling at Grandma?" Tom asked, looking confused. Before I could answer, my mother spoke up. "Oh, sweetie, Daddy's just upset because I'm trying to help you all. He's always been like this." And just like that, the kids were on her side. Emma hugged her, and Tom stood next to her, looking at me like I was the bad guy. My own children, who I had always been close to, were siding with her. I stood there, feeling completely cornered. My family was turning against me, my partner was unsure of what to think, and my kids were looking at me like I was the problem. The divide was deeper than ever, and I didn't know how to fix it. Update 4. The changes in Emma and Tom were slow at first, but soon impossible to ignore. They stopped coming to me for things like they used to. Instead of asking me to help with homework or take them to the park, they started spending more time with my mother. After school, they'd rush to her room instead of hanging out with me in the living room. She'd tell them stories, make them laugh, and always had a little treat waiting for them. I noticed they were becoming distant. When I tried to engage them in conversation, their answers were short and dismissive. They'd smile and run off to spend time with Grandma. At dinner, I'd ask about their day, but instead of looking at me, they'd glance at her, as if waiting for approval before speaking. The kids who used to follow me everywhere now barely listened when I spoke, and it felt like they were slipping away. It got worse when my mother offered to take them for the weekend. "You look tired, Mark. Why don't I take the kids? Give you a break," she suggested one Friday afternoon. The kids' faces lit up at the idea, and before I could even consider it, they were begging to go. At first, I resisted. "No, we have plans this weekend," I said, hoping to spend time with them. But the kids wouldn't let it go. "Please, Dad. Grandma says we can go to the movies and eat out. It'll be fun." Reluctantly, I gave in, but I knew what this was, another attempt to get them on her side. That weekend, they came back with bags full of new clothes and toys, things I never would have bought them. It wasn't just the gifts though. They acted different, more defiant. When I asked them to do their chores, they hesitated, looking to my mother for approval. "Do we have to, Grandma?" Emma asked, avoiding my gaze. My mother smiled. "Oh, let them relax, Mark. They're just kids." I couldn't believe it. She wasn't just undermining me anymore. She was actively encouraging them to challenge my authority, and it was working. The kids stopped listening to me altogether. If I said no to something, they'd go straight to her. If I laid down a rule, she'd bend it the moment I turned my back. I felt the walls closing in, and my suspicions were growing. I started noticing little things: whispered conversations between my mother and Jane, strange looks from the neighbors. One day I overheard Tom telling his friend that Grandma said, "Dad's just stressed and needs to relax more." It felt like she was planting these ideas everywhere, and I had no control over it. That's when I decided to investigate. Something wasn't adding up. How was she getting so much influence over everyone? Why was everyone suddenly questioning me? One evening, when my mother was out with the kids, I went into her room. I knew it was wrong, but I had to know what she was up to. I started searching through her things, not even sure what I was looking for. After going through drawers of random stuff, I found her phone. There were messages to people I didn't know, but one thread caught my eye. It was a series of texts between her and a number that wasn't saved in her contacts. The messages were about me. Still concerned about Mark's state of mind, one message read, "I think the children would benefit from more oversight." I scrolled further and realized she had been in contact with Child Protective Services. The messages were vague, but clear enough. She had made calls, raising concerns about my parenting and even questioning my mental health. She was trying to paint a picture of me as unstable and unfit to care for my own kids. I felt sick reading it. There hadn't been any visits from CPS yet, but just knowing she had taken that step made my blood run cold. She wasn't just trying to turn the kids against me. She was trying to destroy my credibility as a father altogether. That night, I confronted Jane. I showed her the messages, hoping she'd finally see what was going on. But instead of the support I expected, she hesitated. "Mark, maybe she's just worried," Jane said quietly, looking away. "She's been through a lot, and maybe she's just trying to help in her own way." I couldn't believe it. Jane was defending her. "You're seriously going to side with her after all of this? She's trying to get CPS involved. She's lying to everyone about me, and you think she's just worried?" Jane sighed. "I don't know, Mark. She's made some good points about your temper and how you've been so stressed lately. Maybe she's just concerned for the kids." That was it. I felt completely isolated. Even my own partner wasn't on my side anymore. The manipulation had worked. My mother had gotten into Jane's head too, just like she had with the kids. I was fighting a battle I couldn't win. Every move I made seemed to backfire, and my mother was always there, playing the victim, acting like she was just trying to help. Things got worse over the next few weeks. My mother's presence in the house was suffocating. The kids barely spoke to me unless they needed something, and when they did, they were quick to argue if I didn't give them what they wanted. "Grandma says you're too strict," Tom told me one night when I refused to let him stay up late. I felt like I was losing control, not just as a father, but as a person. My mother continued to offer help, suggesting that she could take the kids for longer periods, even suggesting they stay with her during the week to give me a break. She'd cook their favorite meals, let them stay up late, and spoil them with gifts. Every time I tried to enforce a rule, she was there to undermine it, chipping away at what little authority I had left. One night, after another argument with Jane about how I was handling things, I realized the truth. I had no way out. If I kicked my mother out, I'd lose the kids completely. They'd see me as the villain, the dad who made their beloved grandma homeless. But keeping her here was tearing my family apart. She had successfully turned everyone against me, and I didn't know how to stop it. I was trapped, and the worst part was, my mother knew it. She'd smile at me from across the room, knowing she had won this round. Update 5. The breaking point came when I discovered my mother had been secretly taking the kids to therapy without my knowledge. I found out when I got an unexpected call from the therapist, Dr. Bennett, who was concerned about what he had been hearing. He mentioned that the kids had been talking about how I was emotionally distant and how their grandmother had shared stories about family trauma from my childhood. The pieces clicked into place. I realized my mother had been feeding the therapist these ideas, using the sessions to further her manipulation. I knew I couldn't let this go unaddressed. That evening, I confronted her. The situation escalated quickly. She didn't just deny what she had done, she turned it back on me, claiming she was only trying to help because she cared about the kids. She accused me of trying to erase her from the family, saying I was the one with the problem, not her. The kids, who were in the next room, heard everything. They came into the room clearly upset and sided with their grandmother. They repeated what she had told them, that I was too harsh, that I was the one causing the trouble in the family. It was like a dagger to the heart, hearing my own children turn against me, echoing the very words my mother had planted in their minds. The situation had spiraled out of control, and I knew I had to make a difficult decision. I couldn't allow her to stay in the house any longer. Her presence was tearing my family apart. So I told her she needed to leave. She packed her things, but before she walked out the door, she delivered one final blow. She told the kids that their father didn't care about family, that I was pushing her away because I didn't want to face the truth. The kids were devastated. They clung to her as she left, crying and asking why she had to go. I tried to explain, but they weren't ready to listen. They only saw that their grandmother, who had become their confidant and ally, was being forced out by their father. After she left, the house felt empty, but not in a way that brought relief. The tension didn't dissipate, it just shifted. The kids withdrew further from me. They were angry, hurt, and confused, and every interaction felt like a struggle. They questioned everything I said, defied rules they used to follow without question, and often retreated to their rooms, shutting me out. Jane, caught in the middle, was struggling too. She had always been the peacemaker, but now she seemed unsure of who was in the right. My mother's influence had left a mark on her as well, making her doubt decisions she once stood by. Our conversations became strained, with an underlying tension that we couldn't seem to shake. We were both trying to navigate this new reality, but the distance between us was growing. In the weeks that followed, it became clear that my mother's departure hadn't solved the problem. It had just left me to deal with the aftermath alone. The kids' behavior continued to reflect the confusion and pain they were feeling. They clung to the idea that their grandmother was the victim, that I was the one who had caused the rift in the family.